One of the most important things for you to learn this week is how to correctly categorize costs that a manufacturing company has. Now, the reason why it's so important to know how to correctly categorize the costs is because different costs are accounted for differently. So let's go ahead and get started and look at what I like to call the cost. Now let's get to our cost diagram. So we're going to start by saying that all costs of a manufacturer can first be split into two big categories. And those two big categories are product costs and period costs. Sometimes product costs are also called inventoriable product costs. So if you see that term, that just refers to our product cost category. This first distinction between these types of costs is very important because product and period costs are accounted for in different ways. Let's start with period costs. Period costs are found on the income statement, and they are recorded to the income statement in the period that they are incurred. That is why they are called period costs. And on the income statement, they will show up in the operating expenses section. Whereas product costs do not go immediately to the income statement, these costs will initially go to the balance sheet. And on the balance sheet, they will go under the assets section, specifically into one of our inventory accounts. And a manufacturer has 3 different inventory accounts. Those are raw materials, work in process, and finished goods. But product costs do eventually make it to the income statement, but not until the items are sold. So ultimately, these costs will be on the income statement, but not until they are sold. So we'll put here that they show up on the income statement when the product is sold. And the expense account on the income statement is cost of goods sold. This is where the product costs are recorded once the items have been sold to the customer. Now we need to talk about which types of costs are product costs and which are period costs. Let's start over here with product costs. I want you to envision a factory. So let's draw ourselves a factory, a couple of smokestacks maybe. Let's have a little bit of smoke coming from the top here, smoke. So this is our factory. Let's give it a door or two, okay? If a cost relates to the factory or happens inside the factory, it is a product cost. Now let's talk about period costs. Let's go back over here. For period costs, I want you to envision a corporate office building, something like this. Now think about the types of costs that happen in a corporate office. This would be things like selling expenses, administration expenses, customer service expenses. Any sort of an expense that you imagine occurring in a corporate office building is a period cost. Now let's add some more branches to our cost tree. We're going to go back to product costs because that is where the branches of our tree are going to happen. There are 3 types of product costs. So we'll draw 3 different branches here. We're going to start with the 2 types of costs that are direct. And those are direct labor and direct materials. Now by direct, I mean that these 2 costs are exactly traced to each item. And traced simply means the amount used is exactly tracked. So as an example, let's talk about direct labor. Direct labor refers specifically to assembly line costs. So assembly line means the workers who are physically involved in building the product. And it isn't only their wages. Now, it would include their wages, but it would also include any other costs related to employing the people on the assembly line. So in addition to their wages, if they have, for example, health insurance costs, that would count as direct labor. And anytime you employ anyone, you have payroll taxes. So any costs associated with the assembly line workers are direct labor. Now, direct labor means we exactly track the amount of assembly line time required to build each of our items. Now let's talk about direct materials. Direct materials are component parts that we use in building our items. So I'm going to put here that they are components. And exactly what the components are depends on what the item is that's being produced. So for example, if we were building vehicles, then our direct materials would include 4 tires per vehicle and 1 windshield. Remember, the key here is that they are components that we are exactly tracking per item. So now let's talk about our third type of product cost over here, which is an indirect cost, and it is called manufacturing overhead. And what I mean by indirect costs is that these costs are not exactly tracked per item. So now we're going to add some more branches to our cost tree because it turns out there are 3 kinds of manufacturing overhead. So we're going to go ahead and put 3 more branches on our tree. The first is indirect labor. Now, indirect labor is still labor that occurs in the factory. It is still labor that is involved in building our product. But what differentiates indirect labor from direct labor? And that differentiation is that indirect labor is not assembly line. So it occurs in the factory, but not on the assembly line. So I want you to imagine what sorts of workers might work in the factory, but not on the assembly line. That might be someone like a factory janitor or a factory maintenance worker or even the factory supervisor. So all of these people work in the factory but are not involved in building the product. This is indirect labor. Let's move to our next type of manufacturing overhead, and that is indirect materials. Indirect materials are some of the components that we use when we are building our product. But what is the difference between indirect materials and direct materials? The only difference here is that indirect materials are components that we decide we're not going to track exactly how much we use up for every item that we produce. So for example, a lot of times there are components that are relatively cheap and inefficient to measure. So imagine if you were a furniture company and you were building tables, you might decide you don't want to count exactly how many nails are used in each table or exactly how many ounces of glue. So we'll make a note here that indirect materials, they tend to be relatively inexpensive items that would be inefficient to track. Now let's get to our final type of overhead here, the last branch of our tree, and we're going to call that other overhead. And things that go under other overhead are items that relate to the factory as a whole. Examples would be things like rent for the factory, or maybe utilities for the factory, maybe even depreciation for the factory. But the key here with other overhead that often hangs up students is that all of these things, rent, utilities, depreciation, they only count as part of other overhead if they are for the factory. So for example, rent on the corporate office building would not be other overhead because it does not relate to the factory. So here we have our completed cost tree. So let's review. Here we have our 3 types of manufacturing overhead: indirect labor, indirect materials, and other overhead. And then up here, we have our 3 types of product costs: manufacturing overhead, direct labor, and direct materials. And then up here, we have product versus period costs. This completes our summary of cost classifications.